Okay, so now let's look at even, odd, and cofunctions. Now we looked at even and odd functions right before example 7, but now we're going to add some cofunctions in with them. And so cofunctions are going to make sense to you because it's like sine and cosine, tangent and cotangent, secant and cosecant. They are cofunctions, okay? And so cofunctions are complements of some trig function. What's a complement? It isn't, oh, you look nice today when we're talking about math. It's they add together to be 90 degrees. So then it says, namely, angles that are complements add to 90 degrees, and they have the same trig ratios. So that's why when we looked at our angles and stuff before, we had sine of 30 degrees was the same exact value as cosine of 60 degrees, because sine and cosine are cofunctions, and 30 and 60 add up to be 90. All right, so sine of pi over 2 minus theta will equal cosine of theta, as long as whatever this angle is and this angle is add to be 90 degrees with sine or cosine, then it's equal. Okay, secant of, or let me go across, excuse me. So cosine of pi over 2 minus theta will equal sine of theta, because cosine and sine are cofunctions. And if you take these two angles and add them together, they're going to equal 90 degrees. Now remember, these are in radians, so it's going to 90 degrees is the same as pi over 2. Alright, secant's cofunction is cosecant. So if you have secant of pi over 2 minus theta, that's going to equal cosecant of theta. Secant and cosecant are cofunctions, and if you add those two angles together, you'll get pi over 2, which is 90 degrees. Same thing going across. Cosecant of pi over 2 minus theta will equal secant of theta. Same reasons. Tangent of theta over 2 will equal cotangent of theta. And cotangent of pi over 2 minus theta will equal tangent of theta. And that's because cotangent and tangent are cofunctions, and if you add the angles together, you'll get pi over 2, which is 90 degrees. So let's look at some examples of this. So example 9 says you use cofunction identities to find the following. And so A says if sine of theta is equal to negative 1/2, find cosine of theta over, find cosine of pi over 2 minus theta. And I may have missaid that in one of the things above. I'm sorry if I did, but you were reading along with me, so hopefully you caught that it was supposed to be pi over 2 if I misspoke. Alright, anyways, back to this problem. So if sine of theta is equal to negative 1/2, find cosine of pi over 2 minus theta. Well, first let's talk about cosine of pi over 2 minus theta. Well, that's a cofunction rule. When I see 90 minus theta or pi over 2 minus theta, so I know cosine's cofunction is sine. But we know the sine of theta already. We know that's equal to negative 1/2. So that means that cosine of pi over 2 minus theta is equal to negative 1/2 as well. On B, it says if cosine of theta is equal to 0.38, find sine of theta minus pi over 2. Ooh, notice this one's backwards, right? Normally we see it as pi over 2 minus theta. So I need to switch those signs. I need pi over 2 to become positive and theta to become negative. So we can do that though because this is sine, and remember sine is an odd function. So the first thing I'm going to do, well, first let's look at this. We know that cosine, I think I just erased something. Okay. Alright, so we know that since we're dealing with cosine here, if we had sine of pi over 2 minus theta, that would equal that cosine of theta, correct? But we don't quite have that. So, but if we did, we would know that sine of pi over 2 minus theta would equal, well, cosine is 0.38, isn't it? Alright, so, but I need those signs on what was given in the problem to change. And so that's dealing with our even and our odds. So we can rewrite sine of theta minus pi over 2. This is the same thing as saying sine of a negative theta plus pi over 2. And so if I wanted to simplify that a little bit, that would be sine of a negative pi over 2 minus theta. Well, we're almost there. The problem is now I've got that negative inside. But remember, sine of a negative angle is equal to the negative sine of that angle. And so now we've got a negative, but we said this was equal to that cosine of theta, didn't we? And so we got negative, and cosine of theta was 0.38. So there would be our solution.